Welcome from me as well. I'm not going to say too much. We have put together an amazing agenda for today. The team, I think this whole EU Open Source Week has also exploded. I don't know what the energy level is today. This whole thing started with a pre-FOSDEM event. So the FOSDEM was the main event, and then it grew to a sort of a commission workshop on Thursday and some other event on Wednesday. And I think a lot of you probably have been around now since Tuesday already. So, but today's agenda and the whole EU Open Source Week, it really reflects, I think, sort of the importance that open source has taken now and this step it has taken into the mainstream political agenda. And I think for those of you who were at the EU Open Source Awards last night, I was up on stage very briefly and I mentioned the power of institutions because Open Forum Europe has been around during the time when Open Standards was very hot and we filled big conference centers and had very high-level speakers at those events. And then, the political conversation moves on. But institutions, they stay on and they maintain the community. They maintain, exchange of knowledge also during those times when the conversation has moved on to other hot topics. And so I think this policy summit has become an institution in some sense because people are expecting that this is going to happen on the Friday before FOSDEM. And certainly I think that OFE is such an institution as well. We have OFE's founder here, Graham Taylor, in the audience today, who founded the organization back in 2005. And the organization, I think, has maintained a community and changed and developed and grown with staff change, leadership change, and when the conversation has moved on. So that's the cue. I changed my words. Ola, thank you. That's the cue for this slide. Laszlo Ignesi is our new executive director. The executive director of OFE, starting on Monday. And I'm very pleased to have Laszlo join us and be able to attend this year's summit. He will start in his role on Monday, but he is here with us today, and we'll hear more about him and hear a few words from him as well later today. So I also want to take this opportunity, of course, to thank Astor. Astor, are you ready? Yes. Astor has been the executive director of OFE for the last 4 years, and under Astor's leadership, Open Forum Europe has not only grown in size, but also in reach. And I think, come up on stage, Astor, and we can just say, And I want to emphasize that for us it's important that this is a thank you, not a goodbye. Astor is going to stay in the community, not go too far. I wonder if you'll be asking for one of the coveted tickets for the 2027 summit. I hope to see you back, Astor. And this is an opportunity for you today to meet with Laszlo, listen to all our speakers, say thank you, but not goodbye to Astor, and just enjoy the show and the rest of the EU Open Source Week, FOSDEM. And I'm going to hand over to Astor, and who will introduce this year's agenda.
Thank you, Sachiko. Good morning, everyone. So I will allow myself one brief personal remark here at the outset, and I just really want to thank all my colleagues, our partners and supporters, and the board for the trust that was placed in me 4 years ago. It's been such a privilege to work with this organization and with so many of you in this room. And I'm also very, very pleased to welcome Laszlo to Open Forum Europe. I know that the organization will be in very, very capable hands, and I look forward to following its next chapter under his leadership. I, on the other hand, will now join the wider community of OFE alumni. But this is not a goodbye speech, because what matters today is the moment we find ourselves in. As Sachiko said, OFE is a stable institution, but the context, I believe, has fundamentally changed from 4 years ago. European policy and industrial engagement with open technologies has matured. Open source is no longer treated as peripheral. It is now widely recognized as a strategic tool for competitiveness, resilience, and digital sovereignty. The question, therefore, is no longer whether open source matters. It is how it can be used deliberatively to advance Europe's strategic objectives. The fact that the European Commission is preparing a European open source strategy, and here it's important to note that it's not merely an internal Commission approach to open source, but a genuinely European one, this really reflects this shift. It also raises more demanding questions for everyone in the open source ecosystem, as well as, of course, at the policymaker level. But what does it actually mean for a country or a continent to leverage open source strategically? Strategy begins with clarity of purpose, and I think for us in Europe, with a sense of urgency. Europe's objectives are well established: strengthening competitiveness, reducing structural dependencies, improving security and resilience. And while doing this, we want to retain meaningful control over the digital infrastructures on which our economy and public services depend. The policy question is therefore not whether open source aligns with these goals, but for which of them it is a particularly effective instrument and what can practically be done. Open source isn't a universal solution. Not everything is software. But in software-driven sectors, and in sectors that are being rapidly softwareized, it is a uniquely powerful one, and one that remains significantly under-leveraged in Europe. I believe that this is our opportunity. Outside Europe, it has been a central enabling factor in the emergence and scaling of global cloud platforms, for example. And I think the insight there is that for those looking for solutions to challenges at scale, open source should be in your interest. A clear starting point for any European open source strategy is to recognize Europe's position in global digital markets. In many critical domains, Europe is a challenger rather than an incumbent. From a continental perspective, openness, open source, open standards, it's not an abstract preference. It's a rational strategic choice. Historically, open systems favor challenges. They lower barriers to entry, they enable collective innovation, and they reduce dependence on platforms controlled elsewhere. And by contrast, proprietary control, restrictive intellectual property regimes, and limited interoperability reinforce the position of dominant incumbents, or the winners of yesterday's economy. And this, I believe, is not a value judgment. It's simply how technology markets evolve. And here I think it's important to consider that open source is not a sector. It's not a specific segment. It is the dominant innovation and production mode for the digital world. It is embedded across all layers of the digital stack and across virtually every sector. All of society is touched by open source. As such, it shapes how innovation spreads, how standards emerge, how dependencies form, and how they are broken. And it also drives where value is created and captured. When a country or a continent leverages open source strategically, It is not just an uncountable number of isolated procurement decisions. It is making deliberate choices about ecosystem structure. It is deciding whether public administrations and companies act as passive consumers of software or as active participants in the ecosystems they depend on. It is deciding whether demand reinforces concentration and lock-in, or whether it supports modularity, interoperability, and competition. And it is deciding whether the maintenance and security of critical software components are treated as short-term operational costs or as long-term infrastructure responsibilities of governments in the 21st century. But this also means, in the more traditional sense of politics, that treating an open source enabled workforce as a strategic imperative. And from this perspective, open source policy is not primarily about substitution in procurement. While this is important, it is also about capability and capacity. It's about influence, it's about managing dependencies in software supply chains, and it's about global leadership. Influence in upstream development, over governance and roadmaps, and how security and resilience are addressed in practice. Jurisdictions that understand this are better positioned to shape the technologies they rely on rather than simply absorb decisions made elsewhere. And I believe that this cannot be achieved through a narrow lens. Procurement matters, absolutely, and this needs to be addressed properly. This will be a big topic of discussion today at the summit. But a strategic approach cannot stop there. Open source as a policy instrument is far broader. It requires thinking and acting at continental scale. Europe already contributes extensively to the global open source ecosystem. European developers, companies, research institutions are deeply embedded across critical projects. The challenge isn't participation. It is leadership, value capture, and the active coordinated management of our strategic dependencies. And without this explicit strategic framing, Europe risks remaining a net contributor to our shared digital infrastructure, while control points, platforms, and economic returns consolidate elsewhere. A credible strategy must align many different policy instruments. Demand-side tools must be used to shape markets, not merely to reduce costs. Maintenance and security of widely reused components must be treated as digital infrastructure, not as discretionary overhead. And software user organizations must be equipped with the skills and governance structures required to engage upstream, rather than outsource dependency management. Managing software dependencies is one of the core challenges in Europe. It requires collective action across industrial ecosystems and sustained cooperation between public and private actors. And above all, it requires this coherence. And again, this is why I want to come back to this potential watershed that this European open source strategy from the Commission could be. We cannot address competition policy, standardization, industrial strategy, or cybersecurity without coherence with an open source approach and thinking. This fragmentation would, in that case, weaken impact, but structure can really enable it. And to really underscore, because on Monday, the call for evidence closes from the European Commission asking for input for the European Open Digital Ecosystem Strategy. It is very significant. The European Commission has, with this, stated that open source is a foundational instrument of Europe's digital and industrial policy. And if I allow myself here one final personal reflection. After many years of work by Open Forum Europe, together with so many of you, it is very encouraging to see this framing gaining real traction at the European level. So, with that in mind, it is very, very valuable and exciting to be able to open the summit with a perspective from the highest level of the European Commission. So, I would like to welcome and introduce a message from Executive Vice President Henna Virkkunen, who will reflect on how open technologies fit into Europe's broader digital strategy and direction ahead. Thank you very much for coming.